of the board of 1787 FP, a digital platform focused on consumer finance. She's also a FinTech advisory board member of CEFPRO, and she's been a researcher of behavioral sciences, and she is a contributing author to Applying Neuroscience to the Business Practice, and also to the book, The Paytech Book. She is an alumni of Stanford University as well as MIT Sloan School of Business. And given the fact of her area of responsibility at PineBridge, we were having a conversation prior to this and trying to understand, how much do they really focus on understanding a firm's governance program and reputation that will obviously impact the reputation long term and obviously impacts the investment. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation and presentation by Alessia. So let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for MetricStream to have this opportunity to discuss this very important topic. So perform with integrity, and the panelists right before and the beginning of the day really has opened it up for the topic quite nicely. Because what happened when we fail to prioritize integrity? We are left with a tremendous amount of reputational risk. Now, as Anna mentioned, I lead the risk and investment risk role at a global asset management firm based in New York. We have presence in 17 countries across the globe. And at the risk of repeating what Anna said, it is extremely important to look at reputational risk in the context of not only the investee companies that you have, but also in terms of your own internal processes and your own operations. Now, I have an ambitious agenda for us today. The first part is really to focus on, does reputational risk belong to integrated risk management processes as we know them? Are there any new metrics that the rise of intangibles in our world, in our daily life, really call for and we should be accountable for? And the third part, and probably the most important, is in light of the rise of intangibles, how do we go ahead and ensure that we are doing enough to measure and manage reputational risk? So the ambitious agenda will be within 50 minutes time, and I leave the last 10 minutes for Q&A. Now, why wouldn't we be just talking about governance in general when we address reputational risk? And the interesting thing about the word of governance, especially from an investor perspective, is that corporate governance has so many different and nuanced definitions. So I will bring about the definition that the CFA Society, that gives the certification for the Certified Financial Analyst program, gives. And it is, as it says in the presentation, it's defined as a system of controls. So governance as a system of controls and procedures which individual companies are managed against. So that tells you that governance is really about all these controls that should benefit, on one hand, executive management teams in their setting priorities for their business, and on the other hand, the board in their oversight, as we heard before. That also tells you that as a system, governance is subject and influenced by several stakeholders group. There are all these groups that provide the information on the basis of which decision-making is led forward and goals, both long-term and short-term, in our organizations are taken. And the problem with defining reputational risk within our regular governance framework is that these interest groups are or can be either conflicting or diverging. So the definition of reputational risk, as we heard before from the chief audit officer at RBC, has been changing dramatically. And we have many supporting statistics through that. As the question at the very beginning has been, how can we build resilience to reputational risk? The counter question is, can we even do that on the basis of the fact that this reputational risk definition is changing so dramatically. And especially in service industries, and if you're part of service industry as myself, especially on the financial companies side, you'll see that we have heightened regulatory demand, both on transparency and short-term decision-making at the board level. Then we have investors that are seeking and scrutinizing companies even more on pay for performance and on executive compensation schemes, and they ask a hell of a lot of questions about that at the annual general meeting of public companies, as well as offline at other meetings. And again, both for small and middle enterprises, private companies, and public companies alike. And then we have a deeper awareness of the role played by intangibles, especially by consumers. And consumers are coming to us both as millennials in terms of their preferences for a diverse range of products, a diverse range of qualities, but on the other hand also as our employee base, as what are their expectations in terms of the integrity bar set by their companies that they're part of. And then you have regulators that are dealing with one key area these days that we find across all service industries: technology. How is that disruptive the way new regulation is set in place, and how is disruptive the legacy regulation that we're asked to report against. Now, all of these supportive statistics for boards, from investors, from consumers, from regulators, are once again raising the bar even higher for integrity and performing with integrity. Now, no wonder then on the topic of reputational risk, intangibles starting playing such a strong role, because they are really full of all misconceptions about these intangibles. What are they? The cost of accounting for consumer preferences and ever-evolving consumer preferences. Are they a fad? Are they going to be there after millennials, which is going to be the next generation of consumers or employees that we're going to be dealing with? In terms of boards, we're always going to have financial regulations geared around what are we, quote unquote, promising on annual shareholder meetings, and the short-term implications on not fulfilling those obligations. And then, once again, interest groups that now, as was pointed earlier, come from having global services, global goods that are within the purchasing power of many consumers that are not necessarily residing in our local community as we know it. So the question really surrounding reputational risk that has changed dramatically, even at least in the last 5 years, has been, are we capturing everything regarding these intangibles? Are there more intangibles that we don't know about that we should be focusing on in order for us to build the right processes surrounding them? Now, one thing neither I nor Anna pointed out before at the introduction was, as of approximately 4 months ago, I took over responsibility from the investment risk function into adding the analysis of reputational risk as part of us being responsible investors. And you hear probably a lot on papers and magazines about the term ESG. How do we account for environmental issues, social issues, yet in the realm of governance processes? And the way I attacked it at the very beginning when I took the role was, if we want to manage our reputational risk that is about these intangibles, we need to call around the table the right people. And what I did, I went ahead and looked at the areas that currently manage or are faced with the risk associated with quantifiable and predictable outcomes. So I gathered at the table representatives from finance, from audit, from supervision, and depending on where you sit in the financial services area, it could be compliance, personnel, or legal. Third-party risk, that in my case are colleagues in IT, in particular IT infrastructure and cyber. The validation personnel, so people that, if you work in a bank, would deal with model or data governance. The CRO, and in this case, he show up himself. The reporting functions, again, depending on where you sit in the food chain of financial services, could be an operations team that reports or liaison directly with customers or with regulators, so to speak. And then corporate development and business development function that sit usually in the executive team by the strategy function. And what did we go ahead and ask them? I asked very simple questions. First of all, I asked to build a little bit of awareness at the firm level of what we meant by reputational risk. And I asked, in your daily life, what do you think is the current trend of reputational risk? Is it higher than usual? Is it about average? Is it lower? Or is it just that we are facing heightened awareness that there is this reputational risk going on? And the most interesting thing was, and I found that I got very different answers depending on what side of the organization it resided. The second question was, well, if we step back and we have to categorize this risk if we want to measure it, acknowledging the fact that it's multifaceted, is it more sitting in the bucket of this culture risk that, again, becomes another squishy subject, or is it part of the cost of doing business, and therefore it is an operational risk that we face? The third question that I asked was, where would the oversight, the direct oversight of reputational risk belong to? Does it belong to senior management? Does it belong to a board committee? Is it only client-facing individuals? Or is everyone else? The fourth was about establishing exposure metrics. So which tools should we utilize or are currently utilized in the organization to quantify the relevant reputational risk exposure? Is it by geography? Like, for example, anti-money laundering practices, would that cover it? Would that be enough? Would that be by client type? If you're dealing, for example, with government entities? By industry? By end market served? If you, for example, are in low-income housing or the like? By consumer type? We discussed millennials before. Or is it just operational awareness surrounding, for example, the lifestyle of tenants if we are running a real estate operation? And the last question that we targeted was regulation. Who regulates reputational risk? Now, the answers I got were quite interesting. And I would say that if we start with the finance department, finance was all worried about capital markets and the funding needs of the organization. Is reputational risk, however we measure, is it going to impact our ability to fundraise or to access our lines of credit? And how? Or is it going to make the cost of funding for our treasurer more expensive? But the answer I got from audit when asked these questions was, what about, so we go around with a standard book of processes to define resilience across pain points of an organization over time. What about we add in there a pain point as lost business opportunities? Would that be something that we can audit? Would that be something that would make it? And in my own 20 years, I would have never expected to find someone in audit or a chief audit officer to actually ask these questions about a gauge and a measure of reputational risk in terms of lost business opportunity. The supervisory people and compliance were all about, we need risk metrics, we need risk analytics. We have to identify it through risk analytics. Third-party risk assessment and IT, when they looked at the infrastructure, they said, clearly for us, what it takes it to say that we truly manage it is an infrastructure that sits across all the functions that we serve, because there's a ubiquitous risk across all the functions. That was a fair point. Now, the answer that I probably expected that doesn't mean anything if I liked it or not, was from the validation desk. And so the validation desk and the model risk analytics colleagues were, it's a non-quant issue. We don't need to do anything about it. We acknowledge that, but we don't really need to do anything. It doesn't belong to our area. The CROs and the CRO office was actually gave an answer where it was quite intriguing and in line with the audit function. It is something that belongs to us. Is it part of the audit process? It should be part of the lost business opportunity, and we should address that not only at executive committee, but in individual product areas. Yes, we need to be, but yet we need to be very careful, because there could be an opportunity to bucket under the same umbrella too strict of a requirement to pass the bar for reputational risk for both our internal purpose for our employees and our customers, and be caught by false positives. And I'll give you an example shortly about what he meant. Operations and reporting simply came back saying, we live in an environment of zero tolerance for any shortfall in measuring reputational risk. So we will always overdo. And the strategy and corporate development function that sits right by the CEO pointed out in the reputational risk survey that all they care for, in theory, was, or prioritizing, was headline risk. How not to make the first page of the Wall Street Journal. Now, let's go back to the set of questions for a moment. When we went ahead and we met as a group and we discussed these findings across our organization, we said, okay, well, if it's really true that from current trends, you have a higher degree of reputational risk, and the CFO found false positives that measuring risk too tightly could lead to, he gave us examples. And the example came from the CRO that had as a previous role this CRO function from a regional bank. And what he pointed out was the lost business opportunity of millennials. Millennials finding that, as an example, diversity not being brought forward in products that the regional bank was offering to, for example, families with multiple children or households with only one parent, would actually be inclined more to switch. And the cost of switching for millennials on an app and opening a bank account somewhere else across the street was happening much faster than they could. Therefore, they had prioritized diversity and ensuring that they were targeting their products to their end markets in the areas that they lived in, predominantly to address this reputational risk of being biased in the products that they were servicing. And that was part of the CRO responsibility of ensuring that reputational risk was also a function of something called financial literacy. So what is how do you measure financial literacy of your customer base? Obviously, if you have many branches, that's certainly not necessarily defined by how many clients you have that pass the approval process based on the FICO score. Because a high FICO score doesn't necessarily mean, or we imply with high FICO score, a high literacy rate. Yet, the bank decided that based on the zip code and based on the income of the people that they were serving, they needed to offer these programs and to start counting. How many people were actually passing with a medium FICO score and yet being deemed by the bank financially literacy. Now, on the topic of who regulates, right? Who regulates? It was the supervision area that discussed the risk analytics that brought a very fair question. It is still about the consumer. If you look at and you do a quick search on the risk analytics surrounding reputational risk, they're all about the incentives given to the consumers in either accessing certain products for their own risk appetite or having products that are specifically designed for them. And the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, as much as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in the US, were the ones that were keeping track of complaints against financial services institutions surrounding the risk appetite of the consumer versus the products that they were sold into. Now, obviously that calls for a very first takeaway from all of this, from running our internal survey, that was integrated risk management as we know it or as we have it is not enough. Because reputational risk is indeed the failure of all of these traditional governance models that we have lived by. And no wonder how there has to be the representation of every part of the business, every one of these functions, from audit to third-party model to validation to the corporate functions in strategy, to really understand which parts of the organizations are feeling the heat of not only heightened awareness but stronger reputational risk of placing specific products that are not in line with the risk appetite of our customers. Now, but if it's the failure of governance, let's go back, because these are, if we think that reputational risk is so now foundational to the business going forward, what is it really foundational about it, and where did governance or is the current integrated risk management models that we have fail? Fail to address, as we said, the rest of the intangibles, but one key part of intangibles, which is the financially material intangibles, the ones that point at all those risks that have been labeled as non-quantifiable and now become quantifiable because of the lost business opportunity. And if that's the case, we have made the switch, probably in the last 4 or 5 years, from a risk world free of these intangibles to a world full of these intangibles, which call for a new set of metrics to be introduced in our risk processes and the governance processes. I call them SIR, sustainability, innovation, and risk management metrics, that all come together, but for what purpose? For the purpose of aligning corporate commitments and corporate behaviors. And why is that? It is what we heard even on the panel before. What we promise to our customers is what we need to judge ourselves on and base the foundation of our reviews. How well are we doing our job in delivering the value of our products or our services to the customer? And to the point of sustainability, as the CRO pointed out, if you're doing low-income credentialing, a financial literacy program and offering your customers or prospects financially literacy programs is as important from a CRO perspective in helping you determine whether, if you offer a product or not, you may be caught into a lost business opportunity. In terms of innovation, when you have from the third-party validation the comment on that this is a risk, reputational risk, that is ubiquitous across all functions that they served globally, it is really a testament of testing that IT infrastructure, even in areas where there's business needs for new infrastructure to be placed. To test whether legacy infrastructure sits well with new fintechs and product innovation that is brought in. And from risk management perspective, understanding the importance that if we do run internally a pay gap analysis by geography, by gender, by employee level or status within an organization, by tenure for the board, you may as well do that in the context of analyzing the perspective of pay for performance in terms of diversity. That's what customers want to know. And I'll give you the example of, and I quote it here, when non-financial risks become financial. That's a quote for the new CEO of an organization called the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB. I don't know if you've heard about this organization, but since 2001, when it was first born as an NGO, the purpose was to add to financial statements and to the 10K of public companies the perspective on which are these intangibles that are financially relevant for an organization by sector. And they cover, in their standards for reporting, these non-financially material issues, 80 different sectors, nuanced by, for example, under financial services, you'll have consumer finance, mortgage finance, and the likes, by 11 different metrics that all correspond to environmental exposures, social exposure, and governance exposures that your business may be having. And they've had a tremendous success, especially as these standards, which are accounting metrics, have been accepted and launched last year at the London Stock Exchange. Now, you had, of the Fortune 500 companies, since the launch of these standards, again, accounting, measurable standards, that were launched in October of last year, you had 35 of the Fortune 500 companies reporting in their annual reports and statements SASB metrics. And I encourage you to look at them for your own respective sector. Now, I'll give you an example of consumer finance, which are the financially material intangibles that, according to SASB, they are important to define whether there is alignment at the corporate level between commitments and those promises that the panelists right before at the beginning of the day mentioned, versus corporate behaviors. For consumer finance would be, first of all, and not surprisingly, customer privacy and data security. How do you measure that? Well, if you're a consumer finance company, you may as well have the number of accounts and the number of account holders whose data is used for a secondary purpose. And how many of these accounts have opt-out policies? Is that something that can be quantifiable and sit someplace in the consumer finance organization? Probably yes. Is it something that is brought to the board attention on a framework and a package? Probably not, unless there is a necessary action because there has been a potential claim associated with legal fees attached to it. The second topic that is listed by SASB under consumer finance, and again, I pick consumer finance as one of these 80 industries, but is data security. So how many data breaches, right? The number, quantifiable number. What percentage involved PII information of customers? The number, aggregate number of monetary losses associated with each breach. And then the third material intangible that SASB recommends for companies adopt and count and measure for a consumer finance company, interestingly enough, are under social selling practices. This goes back to our CRO point of view. What's the percentage of total remuneration by people that are client-facing that is variable and that is linked to the placing in the market of new products or services? There's also under selling practices tracking the approval rate for high FICO scores, medium FICO scores, or low FICO scores. And then the number of complaints filed with the organizations such as the CFPB, and how many, what percentage of these complaints resulted in an investigation by branches, by location, by geographic area. So this is just an example of how some of these intangibles, again, data privacy, data security, the ability to respond to customer inquiries in these buckets that are either by customer and market or geography or gender or millennial versus non-millennial type, have become extremely important to grow the business, as also to promote an environment where businesses, there's zero tolerance for reputational risk, but there's also the ability to count and to hold ourselves accountable whether we have lost business opportunities in areas that we should grow with. Now, the best question that I was asked was, so can you list the areas where corporate commitments and corporate behaviors for public companies have failed, they are misaligned? Well, look at this list for 2018. And I'm sourcing a reputational risk provider that deals with headline risk out of Zurich, Switzerland, and the name is RepRisk. They publish every year, for free on their website, the most controversial list. And for corporate commitments, we take the commitments that have been signed by over 10,000 CEOs between public companies and private companies, small and middle enterprises as well, in the last 10 years, to the UN Global Compact Initiative. And the UN Global Compact Initiative, for those of you who are not familiar, was launched 20 years ago in January of 1999 by UN Secretary Kofi Annan with the premise of getting corporate leaders, again, CEO level, to commit to advance economic development by getting rid of human rights abuses, getting rid of labor-related issues, and getting rid of corruption and bribery issues around the globe. And we have, as of today, I think 13,000 organizations, so 13,000 CEOs that have committed to this. Yet, if we look at how many companies have been flagged for corporate commitments not meeting their behaviors, there are quite a few. And which are these corporate commitments that have come into question and they've been, quote unquote, most controversial last year? Pretty remarkably, the first one was forced labor. The second one, dealing with human right abuses, and the third one, anti-corruption practices, in particular bribery and anti-money laundering. Now, it is the 20 years in of these commitments. And we are dealing with companies that we can't just flag they work in emerging markets. These are actually coming from the vast majority operating in developed economies and publicly listed companies. But particularly of these corporate behaviors, which were the issues that were flagged the most? Well, occupational health and safety, health and environmental impact of products and services, and corporate complacency at either executive management team or board level surrounding any of these issues. Now, I go back and first of all, I want to mention to my colleagues in the validation team that, specifically said it's not measurable. These are pretty measurable, right? Occupational health and safety. Have you ever heard about near miss frequency? Okay, how many people almost made it, through an incident? How many number of days in the workforce that are off work because of an injury? Products, health and safety and impact of products, passing hazardous chemicals standards, and then having products that actually don't pass an audit for that, and chemicals use in our manufacturing facilities, or corporate complacency surrounding approval rate of FICO scores that were misleadingly assigned. Now, when we take a look at that, we probably also need to realize then that the way to address and attack reputational risk, if it's a failure, as we said, of our governance practices and models, and if we need to measure it and start measuring it, it is really about the degree of transparency and disclosure that we utilize on themes of sustainability, of innovation, and risk. And they are pretty quantifiable, as I've shown. So if we start with those that are quantifiable, we are already adding enough transparency and disclosure in our organizations to fill that gap at the organizational level that allows us to really measure at a higher level how we are delivering the value we do. Now, the next point I want to make is, we heard even before in the panel, there is the connection between reputational risk and brand. And there is this interesting myth of pretty much all of us in the room have heard that a good company never fails to make a good decision, right? It's about decision-making, apparently, to hold a brand, high up in the realm of the perfect brand. So it looks like decreased reputational risk, so lower reputational risk is associated with increased brand equity. Is that the case? Or is it maybe we have not been caught yet because we have not been measuring, right? So when we discuss brand, let's be very clear, and there have been many, not only academic studies, but industry studies about this. It is about having favorable public perception of our business practices, nothing else. So when that perception deteriorates, for example, industry-wise, right, then there is the emergence of cases of lost business opportunities. So when we ask ourselves, does the reverse hold, that lower reputational risk yields stronger brand equity, right? Let's realize that by virtue of operating in specific sectors, you're always going to have a higher reputational risk because it's the cost of doing business. If you are dealing in the chemicals business, you're always going to have environmental issues you're dealing with. If you're working in metals and mining, you're always going to have issues surrounding specific sector and resource allocations that you have or not with your local communities. And sector level reputational risk, it is brand agnostic. And one example that I always like to give is, my accent probably gives it away, but I'm Italian. And the one thing that everybody always mentions to me about Italy is when they go on a cruise. Now, I don't want to mention what has just recently happened off the coast of Venice, but if we think 7-8 years ago, in 2012, you had Carnival cruises being severely hit in terms of reputational risk by the fact that one of their biggest ships, the Costa Concordia, inadvertently missed a hidden rock, and it caused 3,000 passengers being in need of being evacuated in 6 hours at danger, 35 of them losing their lives, and the entire staff almost leaving and trying to run for their lives. So what did it do to the entire economy of the tourism industry since 2012? Not just for Carnival, but for everybody else, if you're thinking Norwegian cruises and other airlines, right? Caribbean. People switched options. You know what? I'm not thinking about a cruise this year. I'm doing something else. So sector level, that reputational risk associated with getting on a cruise and having this question from customers, am I safe enough to reach peacefully the other side of my journey? Is this something that, it was not brand specific, it was industry-wide. Therefore, the third takeaway I'd like you to think about is how reputational risk has a faster transmission mechanism than brand alone, right? It just stays with you longer, and it takes longer to recover than just a brand-related public perception of whether your goods are good enough or whether your goods are the latest and greatest that customers need. So it's very interesting, right, to notice that, number one, how did we get into the whole topic of reputational risk in the last 5 years? Has been because of market disruptions. It's these intangibles that deal with the environment, with our workforce, with our consumers, we have always had. Yet market disruptions have changed the way we engage, we source information, and also the way we manage talent. At the firm level, we digest a hell of a lot of data more rapidly, as it was pointed out before, and we have pretty well-known evidence of regulators across the globe looking at technology and trying to regulate the technology use. But we also have the opportunity, an opportunity that are used for investment in the areas where reputational risk could provide opportunities, invest in our risk processes, and also invest in our compliance and compliance supervisory tools that allow compliance and supervisory professionals to now be talking about corporate strategy. They now start talking about issues surrounding how do we get to the next level of funding that is needed to grow the business? Can we contribute to that? And how we do. So what I encourage you to do is to realize that just running business as usual in an integrated risk management framework is not enough. That somehow you need to run your own anecdotal survey, the survey that I suggested that covers current trends, that puts awareness into it is a cultural risk. There is a cultural risk blend with the operational cost of doing business in specific sectors. There are people that have direct oversight, but quite frankly, the direct oversight is anybody that raises their hand. And exposure metrics are actually quantifiable when we think about at least singling out the areas of reputational risk that are financially material to our organization. And then regulation-wise, consumer-related regulators are the ones that are coming across as the strongest in dealing with reputational risk. So it's time to run your own survey, or I would if I were you, as it's been tremendously helpful on my end. And now I'll open it up for questions, since we have approximately 7 minutes to go up until break. I'll give you a minute if you have any. Anthony? Oh, great. And there's a mic coming your way, actually. But I can hear you. If you want, I can repeat your question.
I noticed you were talking about the stakeholders, boards, investors, consumers, and regulators. And I wanted to ask you what you thought about considering subcontractors and vendors as part of that stakeholder group. And the second thing I wanted you to comment on was this idea of using zip codes and FICO scores as kind of a recognition of the unfair side of business. Something we used to call in the United States redlining. Mm-hmm. There's a dark side to this. You could, okay.
Yeah. Well, those are all fair questions. And by the way, yes, this everything I said today is all about things that I heard with my own ears in surveys. So yes, the first one is absolutely the reason why we had at the table, and let's go back to that. Give me a second. The reason why at the table, my nice little round table, I had third-party risk is to cover as well anything that is associated with vendors. Obviously, if you are in a financial services or a services in general, any vendor is associated with an organization through some sort of infrastructure that goes through IT. So the easier way to get to discuss vendors and vendor policies, and if those vendors, and to make those vendors part of the table, was to third-party risk personnel. So absolutely, they are at the table. They have to be unified with the overall addressing the reputational risk, not only in policies associated with them, but updating those policies. How do we source the vendors that we partner with? That's extremely important. On the thought of redlining, right, from the CRO, you see the false positives. I agree with you. The vast majority, and we heard about it before, right, when we talk about when we deal with customer data and we deal with the ability from customers to actually opt out there's a specific opt-out policy. Well, it turns out that opt-out policies are not well advertised. So the reason for picking regional banks, it is so important, right, in an environment where we say, look, funding small and middle enterprises, finding all the people that may have low FICO scores simply because they're just getting started. There's not enough history, right, that a model will give. It is extremely important. Now, if you don't advertise it and you open a customer to the opportunity to have their data utilized for a secondary purpose, goes back into that integrity bar and rising the integrity bar, right, that we heard before, the Royal Bank of Canada CIO talking about how customers, if the customer was sitting by you, would they be happy to see what you do with their data? So absolutely. But again, going back to the survey and the survey findings that I've run, you realize that more and more it goes back into the chief risk officer role, or saying, look, you may have false positive for the wrong reason, for those reasons that you would call, or they may have called historically, like redlining, that maybe they're off the chart of any process, yet at the local level or at the individual lower end level in the organization, where you have selling practices that should be promoted to avoid the redlining, redlining, it's actually happening. So I agree. Very good questions. Anyone else?
Good morning, Alessia.
Hi.
Hi. I can attend Marcano for Citizens Bank, Trinidad and Tobago. I like your presentation. I may have missed the first part, though. Did you speak about how do you set enterprise-level reputation risk metrics that can cascade down to individual business lines? Because one of the challenges we face is that we're comfortable setting top line, enterprise level market risk metrics, whether it's VAR or duration or whatever, credit risk metrics. But when it comes to reputational risk, you kind of get a bit stuck, because you want an overall metric that can still be cascaded down by line of business, by jurisdiction, by product type, and that's where it gets a little tricky.
Yeah.
So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, and I guess the reason for highlighting the controversial list of all the corporate commitments and the corporate behaviors and the misaligning of that for last year is actually an important component of your what you rightly pointed out, that the cascade is between, you have commitments that are set at the top of an organization, right? And they are pretty much public commitments, right? And then you have behaviors that, two of them, if you see them as issues, are you have occupational health and safety or the impact of your products or servicing on your consumer. But then on the other hand, you also, that are pretty basic, right? You go from your selling practices all the way up to how you handle your issues that affect your employees and your customers, all the way needing to be reporting upstream to your CROs and go back into the CEO and the board and the audit committee. On the other hand, you have corporate complacency on how many of these distances are enough, or how many do you need in order for these issues that you have within your product areas and within your business development organization that need to go up and get elevated. And obviously on that topic is any one of this that deal with either sustainability or innovation need to be brought up. As we heard before, right, from James Quigley, too much information is floating to the board. That's where the important aspect is, as you see on the slide, we just have 3 of them, right? But if the board is not aware of them, or if somebody's afraid of reporting, then becomes quite difficult for the board even to decide whether they are important usage of their time or not. But yeah, your question is extremely valuable. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Linda Chapman from Montala. So I wanted to ask you whether or not you have been able to come up with any kind of equation for the financial impact of a risk event. Like I'm sorry I missed so much of your presentation. My flight was delayed. But this is a really fascinating topic, and I've not yet seen anything that gives you an equation, yet brands have value. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can give you an answer as an investor, if you don't mind. So I'll take my latest 4 months of running the sustainable investing function and understanding how reputational risk is actually incorporated in the value assessment from a credit perspective, how much credit you give to an organization that has a high degree of awareness and is doing something about reputational risk in these areas or not. And I can tell you that the equation is quite simple. It is equal weighted. If you have an environmental issue, and again, me personally, I use the SASB standards in order for me to understand if by sector, which are, I mentioned before, I don't know if you heard, the ones for consumer finance. So I look pretty much how many data breaches, if you are in a consumer company, consumer finance investee company, you have had, how many of those policies that, for example, provide opt-out for a customer in order for them to remain the sole owners of how their information is utilized, or they're aware of any secondary use of their information. And the third one would be selling practices, as an example, for consumer finance. Those are quite quantifiable, and those are metrics that can be used to not only address whether these companies that you're looking at, again, consumer finance, it could be healthcare, it could be a life insurer, it could be, you name it, any of them. Once you have those set of standards that you can apply, then you can look at those and say, on an equally weighted basis, how is this company comparing to this other one? And you start penalizing the companies that are not providing enough transparency and are not willing to make the disclosure. And I can tell you that there's fewer and fewer companies where you don't find even the investor relations teams that are not willing to give you this kind of time of day. They all want that because they're all looking at investors that are becoming more and more for which this kind of information is becoming more and more important. Up until the day in which, up until the day in which we had 7 to 8 years ago, the issue of financial materiality, then people would not even discount them in their cost of funding. But now you found, even at the CFO level, right, that you had people telling you, there's an area that is called capital markets that if we don't actually show excellence in handling this reputational risk according to the financial material metrics, we're going to be penalized for. And then you have the audit department being concerned about, is our audit practices not capturing the lost business opportunity? Are they stale? And then you had the CRO office, as Anthony, this gentleman here, was pointing out before, how there may be false positives if you just go with a book that is sector agnostic. For that reason, that higher brand doesn't necessarily shield you from the reputational risk that you're penalized for. And I hope I answer your questions, but I'm open to offline questions as well.
Okay, well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up from there, but let's give our speaker a big round of applause.
Thank you.